really good to be at a conference, even though it's a virtual one still this year. Would have been really nice to see everyone in person, but hopefully next year is going to be that year. Regardless, super happy to be talking to folks about some exciting new things that we've been working on. Specifically, I want to talk about a new product that we've built, a new front-end framework specifically for Java backends. So my name is Marcus Hellberg. I work as the head of the community team over at Vaadin. For the past 15 or so years, I've been working in this kind of intersection of modern web and Java. Well, I guess back then it wasn't what we would consider modern web today, but essentially I've been really interested throughout my career in just understanding new web technologies, how we can use those to kind of build really cool applications. And really my passion is also taking those learnings that I have and sharing them with people. So that's something that I can fortunately do quite a lot in my job. So in the before pandemic times, I used to travel a lot to different events like this and speak in person. Nowadays, it's more sitting in place and doing these and writing a lot of tutorials and doing online stuff. But today I want to be talking about building web applications. And if you've tried to build a web application recently, gone online and just kind of searched for ways of building web apps, you've probably been bombarded by just this immense amount of different tools, libraries, frameworks, you name it out there. And it might be a little bit overwhelming to understand, like, where should you start? How do you ensure that you build something that you can not only get done, but also kind of maintain going forward? So I feel like before I can really introduce you to what our new product Vaadin Fusion is, I need to kind of place it in the greater context of all that is the web development ecosystem today. So I want to just kind of spend a little bit of time kind of explaining where this fits into the larger picture of web development today. So we're going to take a look at some probably well-known libraries to everyone here. So things like React, Lit, Vue.js, Angular, and Vaadin Fusion. And usually I like to look at these kind of on a continuum from the smaller libraries like React and Lit being in the one end of the spectrum where you have a lot of choice, but also you don't get a whole lot. So it means that you as a developer have to kind of provide most of the functionality as you're starting to build your app. So you get a small component API, but when you start building an app, you need to rely on quite a lot of third-party libraries for things like, say, rounding or state management and so on. If we take one step further towards the kind of more productivity on this continuum, we start getting into frameworks that not only provide us with a API for creating components, but it start including some of those features that we need when we're building apps out of the components. So it'll have things like routing, so we can get from one view to another, might have some form helpers so we can bind data from an object into UI fields and so on, maybe state management so we can kind of keep different parts of the application in sync. Going further along, we'll get into kind of more fully featured frameworks or platforms that not only contain all those things, but also usually some kind of tooling that kind of codifies how you should test the application, maybe some kind of built-in tools or UI components. But all of these up until now are kind of front-end only, so they don't really care what you use on the backend, for both good and bad. But with all of these, essentially, you as a developer will, in addition to this, need to, of course, have something that you can run on the backend on your server to actually persist data and run some business logic and so on. And that's really where Vaadin Fusion comes in. So it combines a front-end framework with a Java backend and make sure that these two things work seamlessly together. So we give you the kind of front-end component API and routing and forms and initialization and testing and so on. But we also give you the server counterpart, and we make sure that those two things can kind of communicate effectively with each other. And the reason why we've chosen to kind of build this integrated stack for developing web apps, specifically for Java, is that if we look at the kind of productivity over time graph, this, by the way, not based on like any exact science, but roughly goes this way. So if you're using a small lightweight library, like say Lit or React by itself, because you kind of need to piece together your own framework of all these third-party libraries, it takes you a little while to kind of get up to speed before you kind of built your own framework. Once you get up to speed, you typically get things done pretty quickly. And then say half a year later, as some of these third-party libraries start kind of diverging and updating themselves, you might run into a situation where you're starting to spend a not insignificant time of your actual development time just fixing small things that break in these integrations instead of spending all that time on building your own application. The problem is a little less severe if you use a front-end framework, where obviously you get a little bit more of these things from the same vendor. So there are fewer choices you need to make up front, so you get started a little bit quicker. And because that framework vendor will kind of help keep at least the package that you get from them compatible, you don't lose as much productivity in the long run. And really, the front end or kind of full stack frameworks then take that one step further, where essentially most of the choices that you need to make upfront to get started have been made for you. So it's a very opinionated way of building an app. But if you're okay with those opinions, it means that you can get started building your app essentially from minute one. And as the kind of project moves along its natural life cycle, because essentially the whole package comes from one vendor, they can make sure that this whole package stays compatible, and you can kind of continue focusing much or most of your development effort on actually on actually building features for your own application. So that is essentially where Vaadin Fusion comes in. So we've built this opinionated full stack web development platform specifically for Java. And instead of kind of building everything ourselves, what we've done is we've chosen what we believe are some of the kind of best technologies out there, and we try to make them work as seamlessly together as possible. So for the backend, we're using Spring Boot. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in a second, but hopefully pretty familiar to many faces here. We're using a component library called Lit on the front end, and we've tied these together with a type-safe server communication, which is pretty nifty, and we'll take a look at that in code in just a moment. We also give you the kind of basics that you would expect to find in a framework like routing, so you can get between different views. We have support for building forms, so you can kind of bind between a model object and the UI, perform things like validations and kind of reverting changes and so on. And one really big part too is that we give you this customizable library of high quality UI components. Instead of needing to build complex things out of divs and styling them, you can start with just fully functional components and build your application out of bigger Lego blocks, so to speak, which again helps you stay productive because you're not really spending that much time on the kind of plumbing, but you're able to express yourself in this kind of way where you have these bigger components. And finally, we've tied all of this together with integrated build tools. So in our case, we use Maven for building the project, and that internally will take care of building the front end server. In development time, it will take care of library loading things as you're coding along. So as a developer, you just need to open one project, start it with Maven, and you can start developing both front end and back end code there. So really exciting stuff. And I'm going to kind of jump into code here in just a moment and spend most of the time just coding some stuff and then showing you in practice what that means. If you're not familiar with Spring Boot, it's also an opinionated framework in a sense. So it's an opinionated way of using the Spring platform. So it gives us things like an embedded web server, so we don't need to configure a web server ourselves when we're developing. It comes with a lot of starter dependencies that we can use that are automatically configured. So in the example that we're going to look at just in a moment, for instance, we're using an embedded H2 database that's enabled for us just by including the starter. And really what you get is just apps that just run is their slogan essentially. So because they've done these opinionated choices for you, it's very quick for you to get started, but not at the expense of it being kind of something that's only useful in development or demos, but it's something that's fast to get started with, but production ready. And that's something that we are also doing with Vaadin. Lit, the component model we use, is kind of similar to React, but smaller and faster. And that's because it's using web standards as its base. So instead of emulating a virtual DOM in JavaScript, for instance, it's deferring a lot of that work to the actual browser engine through some new web standards. So that means that in just less than 5K of JavaScript, you get a very powerful, small utility that allows you to essentially just define your own HTML elements. And that's a really powerful thing because those elements are kind of something that you can reuse not only in your Fusion application, but say if you're a larger organization, you can reuse those components across different apps, perhaps even built with different frameworks. So it's a pretty nifty little library, and I'll show you that one of its strengths is that it's built on these standards, which means that if you're familiar with basic JavaScript or TypeScript in our case, it's very quick to pick up because there are very few kind of library specific concepts for us to learn, as opposed to React, for instance, where we need to maybe learn things like hooks and how to kind of reason about them. And then, like I said, we ship a large set of these UI components that you can use. And these are really one of the things that will keep you very productive, because you don't need to start from the kind of smallest little thing when you're building your application, but you can take these large blocks of functionality and piece together your application from them. So that's going to let you build something meaningful in a very short amount of time. All right, so instead of having slides for all of this, what I want to do is jump into some code and show you live. Obviously, this being a live presentation, that means that things may go wrong. So if things go wrong, please help me out. Just kind of write into the chat or put your mic on and let me know what's going on so we can hopefully kind of figure things out together. All right. So here we are in a hello world view. And this is essentially a very small LitElement class. So if we look at what's running in the browser here, let's inspect this actual element here. This one, you'll see that we have a demo view HTML tag name here. So what we define here as the tag name is the tag name that will show up running in the browser. This is a reactive component model, meaning that we have a declarative template and that reacts to changes in properties. Properties are essentially fields that we annotate with a property or a state property decorator like this. So let's use one for capturing a name. And for now, the name will start out as empty. And then we can use that state in our template. So we could say this.name, or if it's empty, then we'll say world. And when we save this, you'll see Vaadin reloads that. And because name is empty, we default to world. But because we're using just basic HTML standards here, we can go in and kind of just modify this live. So we can say that the name should instead be Marcus. And you can see that it reacts to that property change immediately. Not only can it, in this case, through attributes, react to that, but we could also programmatically, by getting a reference to it, we can set the name to be, for instance, JCON, like this. And again, it updates live. All right, so that's the basics. We have properties, and whenever those change, Lit will react by re-rendering the template in a very efficient manner. So let's take a look at how we can react to user input. So instead of kind of expecting people to open up their dev tools to change the name, let's provide an input for them to do that. So create a new input here, just a plain text input. We'll bind the value of it. So by using the dot here, we bind to a property. Essentially, what that means is that we're essentially doing the same as we did here, the console. So we're programmatically setting it. We're not setting it through an attribute. So we'll set the value equal to this dot name. So whatever the name is currently, then we listen for the input event, which is fired on every keystroke. And we get the event. Just going to cast it to any here for the sake of simplicity. And what we do is we just update the name to be the same as the inputted value. So event target value, right? Like that. And we get an input here. And if I type something in here, you can see that it automatically updates our template here. Now, as I said, Vaadin comes with a whole bunch of these components that we can use. So if we instead import Vaadin text field like that, we can change this basic input to be a Vaadin text field. And being a component, we need to have a end tag for it like this. And this is still an input field, but it has some more features than just a plain HTML input field. So we can, for instance, define a label on it, name, so that people know what they could say. And maybe we could even have like a clear button visible here. So if we type in something like Marcus, we have a clear button here. So we kind of have a component that can encapsulate a whole lot of that functionality. Now, this is still an easy component, so let's take a look at something a little bit more interesting and really get into that value of having an integrated framework. So if I open up the sidebar here in my project and we take a quick look at what we have here, in the source main Java folder, I have a few things. So I have a person Java entity, which has some basic things like first name, last name, email, phone, birth date, and so on. And to access the database and kind of persist those, we have a repository, which is using a JPA repository. And we have a generator here that ran and just generated 100 test users for us. So we have a little bit of data that we can work with. And really where the magic of Fusion comes in is through something we called endpoints. Conceptually, they're very similar to REST endpoints in that you're exposing a API, but the difference is that you're not using HTTP verbs to describe that, but instead they're more like an RPC almost. So let's take a look at what that means in practice. So we'll create a new endpoint here, person endpoint, and I'll close that just so we have some more space. And in order to turn a class into an endpoint, we give it the endpoint annotation like that. And then we're not going to configure security right now. So I'm going to say anonymous allowed like that. And then I'm going to auto wire in that repository so we have access to our database. So just have a public person endpoint constructor taking in the person repository repo. And then we'll take this, assign it to a field so we have access to it. And then we can start creating our API here. So what I want to have is one method that I can use to just fetch the contents of our database here. So I want to have something that returns a list of person objects like that. And this can just be find all for now, like that. Then what we return is what we get from calling the repo find all. Now, I want to warn that this is demo code. You probably don't want to ever return find all from a actual database because you might have tens of thousands of records there. But for the sake of this, it works. All right. So by just creating a class with this endpoint annotation, some very interesting things will happen. So let's go here and define another property. In this case, I'm going to use the state decorator here. So it's still a property, but this is just internal state to the view. It's not something that we want to expose as external API. So not something that somebody should be able to set as an attribute, for instance, on this. And this will be, let's call it people. And this will be a person array. And might be a little subtle here, but what we actually just did was we imported a TypeScript type person that was automatically generated to us based on our Java return type. So we now have a way of kind of synchronizing the data types that we expose from the backend service to what we use in the client. Now, of course, we need to call the backend to get those people. I'm going to override a connected callback here, which is a part of the web component spec. So this will get called whenever this view is attached to the DOM. Here we need to call connected callback on the parent. And I will actually use a async method here because all the backend calls are asynchronous by nature, and TypeScript and JavaScript have this very powerful concept of async methods that really make it easy for us to write legible kind of code that looks like it's just synchronous, but it's actually non-blocking. So we can say that this dot people should be equal to, and then use the wait keyword to kind of suspend the execution there in a non-blocking way until our call to, let's see, person endpoint was what we created, find all. So again, here we're able to call this method on the Java class as if it were a TypeScript method. Now we're getting a error here saying that the types don't match. And the reason for that is that Java is pretty lax when it comes to nullability, and much more so than TypeScript. So we need to actually kind of guide Vaadin here a little bit to kind of assure that as API designers, we're responsible to for this. And in this case, I'm going to say that I'm never going to return null values. I'm going to return an empty list or a list with elements. So I'm going to use a non-null annotation here. Also, I'm going to be responsible in that I'm either going to return person objects or nothing. So I'm not going to put in some random null values into the array. And by doing that, I'll get a much more kind of easy way to handle them on the client, because I don't have to worry about either the array itself being null or just random elements within that array being null. So again, here you're able to kind of see that we're able to avoid a lot of like misunderstandings in API design, because we're kind of forced to make those decisions up front now. How do we want to deal with those? So what happens now is that when we connect, essentially when we show this view, we call the backend, we find people, we put them in a state variable here, which means that we can now start using them. So first of all, let's just do a little plain HTML example here, just to show you how you can kind of nest these templates. So we'll take this people, which is the array of person object, and we're going to map over it. So for each element, we want to return something else. And what we want to return here is a HTML snippet. And that's essentially the same we return here from the render method. So we're returning a subtemplate. And here, we're going to return a list item, and we're just going to take the, let's say, email from that person. So again, here you can see that we have autocomplete. We can see what are the properties on that person. We'll save this, and we can see that we have all these people here now. But it would be a lot kind of more convenient if we could see those in a data grid. So let's import another Vaadin component here. So we'll import a Vaadin grid. And then instead of having this unordered list here, we'll have a Vaadin grid. And this will have been taken as a configuration, some columns. So Vaadin grid column. And we have to set a property of path on it. And we want to have 3 of these. like that. I'm using emmet here to generate HTML through this shorthand syntax. If you're wondering what is going on and where all this is coming from, it's emmet, and it's something that's in most HTML editors. So first name, last name, email. And then what we can do here is very much the same as we did up here for the name. We're going to bind the items property to this array that we have. So this dot people, right? We'll save that. And now we have a data grid here with all these people. And that's pretty cool. All right, so what I want to do then is take a look at editing these, so how we could create a form for them. But first, what I want to do is I want to kind of select a person from here so that we can show a form for that person underneath. So for that, let's create one more piece of state here. And that'll be the selected person. And this will be an optional thing, so it might be undefined as well, like this. And then we need a method that we can call whenever a new row has been activated here. So let's call this selection change, and we get an event, which will be a grid active item changed event of type person. So if you've never worked with TypeScript before, it might kind of look both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. So we're defining the type behind the parameter name, and there's a colon. But I'm guessing if you know Java, you're probably going to be able to follow along this without too much trouble. And what we can then set here is the selected person should be equal to the event detail value. And that's again typed, so we can see that this property will always be a person. All right, so now we have a way of listening for that, but we need to instruct the grid to actually use that. So we have our items bound. We use the @ symbol to bind to events, and we can again see what are the different events getting triggered. So we want to use the active items changed, bind that to our selected selection changed. And then we're going to set the selected items, which are essentially the highlighted items. The grid supports both multi and single select. So I'm going to use this selected person like this. So by inlining an array here, it'll either be an array of 0 or 1 elements here. And clicking on a row now, you can see we'll select that here. Good. So now that we have that, we're able to start building the next part, which is a grid for us to, or sorry, a form for us to edit these. For that, I'm going to use some of the convenient CSS class names that we have. So what I want is a CSS grid with a medium gap and all the items aligned on their baseline. So I can do that by making a grid with grid calls 2, so 2 columns, gap medium, items, baseline, like that. So that'll give us a 2-column grid with a medium gap and everything aligned to the baseline. And also I want to have this hidden if we don't have a selected person. So one thing that's very nice to notice here is that we're never imperatively explicitly saying, like, when we select something, say here, that go and hide this form. We should in the template, we just say that this should always be hidden if there's no selected person. And after that, it's enough for us to just update the state here, and the template will always be in sync with that. All right, so let's just create fields for editing all of these things. So I'll do a Vaadin text field, and we'll have a label on those. And we need 2 of them. 2 of them like that. All right. So the first one will be for first name, other one will be for last name, like that. And then we're going to use a specific email field that we happen to have for that. So we'll import the email field, and then we'll do a Vaadin email field like that. That would be, oops, actually, last name, first name. And then I want to have a button that we can use for saving. So again, I'll import a Vaadin. There is kind of auto import of unknown components kind of works, but also kind of doesn't. My VS Code wasn't very cooperative, so I'm doing it by hand right now just to ensure everything works. So we'll have a Vaadin button, we'll have a theme variant of primary on it, and say save. Okay, so let's see if this works. Now, what should happen is that when we select something, we get a form here, and when we unselect something, it will disappear. Now, the next thing we want to do is somehow bind this selected person to this, and that's where a Vaadin concept called a binder comes in. So binder helps us bind a object to input fields. So we'll create a field here called binder. Will be a new binder that's bound to this as the element, and then we're using something called a model here. So we find that we use a person model. So when we created this endpoint and exposed this person, not only did we get the type for the person, but we also got this model. The difference between the person type and the person model is the model also includes information about validation. So if you remember in our Java code for person, we had some validation rules here like email or non-null, and we're able to reuse those in our UI fields through this person model. So when we have the binder, we want to make sure that we first of all read in that value. So if this dot selected person, then we're going to call this dot binder dot read this dot selected person, and else we're going to clear it. So this dot binder dot clear, and then we need to use the binder to bind it. And the way we do that is here in our render method. We're going to first of all get a hold of the instance of that model, and we can get that through the binder. So we'll do a const of model, and we get that from this dot binder. If you're not familiar with this syntax, what I'm doing is I'm destructuring the binder object to this variable. So this is equal to me saying this dot binder dot model, but it's slightly less work, especially if you're trying to get several variables pulled out of there. But that's essentially what we're doing. So we get the model here, and what we can do then is use this field directive that we have to essentially bind several things at the same time. So we'll do a field to model dot, and we need to import this. And so the first thing we want to bind to is the first name property of the model, last name, and email. And if we go here now, what should happen is that if we, for instance, on the email, now make it invalid, we can see that we get these validation errors. And as we select different people, you can see that they're getting shown here. So that really seems to work pretty well. And the last thing we then want to do is hook up this save button. So for that to work, we of course need some backend API for that to happen. So we'll create a new endpoint method, public person save, person p. The most difficult thing is jumping between Java and TypeScript is getting the order right here. And we'll return the repo.save p. All right. So we have the backend there. Then we need to bind the button click to a new method that we can use to save. It's not save. And of course, we need to create that. So this will be another async method because we're calling the server and we want to do that asynchronously. And here we can use the binder to submit the value. So we'll capture the return value as saved, and we'll await this .binder that submit to. So we can just submit the form to our endpoint, person endpoint.save, like that. And then if we saved something and do a little bit of TypeScript array magic here, but pretty simple stuff if you've worked with any kind of immutable data structures in JavaScript before. So this people will be equal to this people.map. So we're essentially mapping over the existing array and just swapping out that one element. So if p.id is equal to the saved ID, then we'll return the saved object and otherwise the original object. And what we can do then is set this .selected person to undefined. All right, let's see if this works. So we select somebody, we can edit them, hit save, see that the value got updated here, the form got hidden, and if we refresh, we can see that it actually was persisted to the backend. So pretty cool. We've been able to build quite a lot of functionality in not that long of a time, and hopefully you've been able to kind of see the value of having this tight integration between the server and the front end, and having the kind of automatic build tooling here. Last thing I want to do is just show the customizability of the components that we have. So I want to actually have a dark theme, and instead of having it this blue, I want to have a slightly like turquoise color. That, no, let's see, that looks pretty good. All right, so I'm gonna copy some CSS over here, and I'm gonna open up my CSS classes here, add those, and then I'm gonna open up my HTML index page and add the theme dark attribute to this. And you can see that that kind of changed the look and feel of our application quite drastically. So now we can see that our application looks quite a bit different, but we still have all the same functionality that we had before. All right. All right, sorry about that. All right, I think that is it for time. I want to make sure that we have some time for questions here. So let's open up this to questions. So I don't know if we have moderators that have any questions. I'm looking at the chat here too. So if you have any questions, feel free to post those in the chat. All right. Let's see. So we have Marcel here said he liked Vaadin 8 style with pure Java, but this looks cool too. So for that, the only thing I can say is that this is a separate framework that just happens to use the same UI component. So if you like the pure Java style, you should use Vaadin Flow, which is exactly the same coding paradigm as Vaadin 8 was pure Java. So this is not a replacement for that, but this is an alternative for those who prefer to work a little bit closer to the Java or to the browser API. All right, Marco asks, is that person repository used in person endpoint a Spring Data repository or something generated by Vaadin? So the repository is just a plain Spring Data repository that I used. Nothing Vaadin specific there. So the only Vaadin specific code in the backend was that endpoint with the endpoint annotation. Keep questions coming. There was one more thing I wanted to show you kind of with derived values here, but so I think we have still 9 more minutes that we can use here. And I want to do filtering here, but keep asking questions as you're watching here. So I'm just going to get a word. So I'll have a filtered people that will create a regular expression of this name. So that was what we started out with, and ignore the use case, and then we'll return this people filter, and then we'll take each person and see, essentially append the first and last name. So we make the full name, first name, last name, and see if that matches our regular expression. And now all we have to actually do, so instead of just straight up using this person array, what we can do is we can have our grid be bound to this filtered people. And with nothing more than that, what we can do is now filter these. So that's another kind of powerful feature of these reactive things, is that with very little work, you can just define how the data should be modified. All right, good. We got another question here from SD. Would you use the entities even in a large application where Hibernate does the caching and lazy loading? Background to my question is I always use model classes for the GI, and they are mapped. So in a real life application, you might want to design DTOs for your views, very similar to maybe how you do a REST API, or if you're doing a service layer between your UI and your backend. So typically in a more complex setting where your entities will have all kinds of references and collections and stuff that may not at all be relevant for what you're displaying in the UI, it's probably better to create a DTO that only contains what you need for that view. Marcel is asking if the endpoints can be reused for different front ends like REST endpoints. At this point, we've built, like I said, this very kind of integrated stack where it's designed to be used by Vaadin, but that's something that could be possible in the future. So if that's something that's interesting to you, go in on the GitHub repo for Fusion and add in a suggestion there, and we'll take that into consideration. All right. Before we run out of time, just want to point you in the right direction. So if you're interested in finding out more about this, you can go to vaadin.com/fusion. We have some examples in the docs for how to get started building simple apps. There's a kind of 2-hour course that covers everything from getting started to actually deploying the application in the cloud. And we have a lot of material on YouTube as well. And Vaadin has a Discord chat that's very kind of active and helpful with other developers in the Vaadin community. All right. I'm going to say thanks from my side. And if you have any questions that you come up with after the fact, that's usually how it goes. You can feel free to answer or ping me on Twitter at Marcus Hellberg, or join our Discord. You'll find, just search for Vaadin Discord on Google and you'll find the Discord server, and feel free to join there and hang out with us. All right. Thank you all for coming. It was fun to do this session, even though I didn't get a chance to meet everyone in person, hopefully next year. So thanks for coming.